expand beyond clubs of rich countries like the G7 to a true global society and true global dialogue. And the G20 process began in one form more than 20 years ago. I was one of the early proponents. Let's make sure we have all countries at the table, not just the rich countries like the G7. So in the early days, the G7 still dominated the process, but the world is changing very fast to a multipolar world in which it's no longer the case that the US and a few other countries dominate the world policy debate, or certainly dominate even the world economy in any way. We're now in a multipolar world, and we have 4 G20s in a row led by important emerging economies: Indonesia last year, India this year, Brazil next year, South Africa the year after. We need these G20s, and I think India's will be especially important, to make the institutional breakthroughs in the global financial architecture and the global governance architecture to turn this changing reality into a changing way of global shared responsibilities. So I'm here because of how important it is that India is president of the G20 and proposing exactly this rebalancing of the international governance system. We have the technologies, especially digital technologies, that can enable countries that were lagging in economic development to make huge progress. And India, of course, is the case in point now. It's the fastest growing large economy in the world. There is a tremendous uptake of digital infrastructure, hundreds of millions of people coming into broadband services, and of course the entire population online in some sense with digital identity and with the digital public services. To my mind, this is very good for India's development, and it enables India's current growth of about 7% per year, which is very good and could accelerate, in fact. We need this kind of pattern in general throughout the developing world. Africa is a good case in point. It's about the same population as India, but it's divided into 55 countries rather than one country. That's because there were many colonial powers in Africa. They carved up the continent, and therefore when independence came, it was dozens of independent countries, all of which were too small to achieve development at scale. Finally, the African Union is really creating a union. And one point that I've made is, first, that the African Union should become the 21st member of the G20 as a permanent member. Second, what India is learning about deploying large-scale digital on a very rapid basis, I think can be a roadmap for Africa as well, and also for strong India-Africa diplomacy and trade. Well, remember, we have many shocks right now, so this is a very unsettling time. We have COVID, we have the financial tightening and even crisis. We have the sanctions regime against Russia. We have the Russia-Ukraine war, and we have the US-China tensions. It's too many. Because on top of all of that are the long-term, deep crises of climate change, environmental degradation, and so on. We need to solve some of these intense geopolitical crises quickly before they overwhelm us in financial, economic, and even military terms. Right now, the system is not operating properly. It's, of course, overwhelmed by the crises, so it's not delivering. And even when the countries come to the IMF, while the IMF helps them, the fact that they're there means it's already too late. It's already being in the emergency room rather than prevention. One of the goals of the G20 needs to be a new financial architecture that is providing a lot more capital to developing countries so that they don't end up in the IMF emergency room. India is achieving huge progress. What we didn't know in 1998 was how the digital revolution would support that whole agenda. Because now with universal, or it's not quite universal, but near universal access to online ID and to bank accounts and to public services, now the rural areas, which were really rural and left behind, can absolutely be fully connected. India is in the process of making significant strides in using digital for healthcare, for education, of course, for payments, for finance, for public services. There's a lot of innovation taking place, not only in Indian business operations, but in science and technology across the country. So I have to feel quite good about the optimism from 25 years ago, and think that India is realizing this potential. Well, even as important as US-China dialogue is India-China dialogue. India and China have both a lot to work out